Hello, I'm Philip Duncan. Thank you very much for joining us for our ClimateWatch update for the month of July, brought to you by weatherwatch.co.nz and our business partners at IBM. So let's take a look first of all at the animated wind map. We're going to go through some soil information, then we'll get into the air pressure maps and rainfall. So as we kick off with the current wind map, as we kick off the 1st of July, high pressure, you can see here in the big white shaded area. Low pressure down here in the Southern Ocean in the darker purpley colours. So there's a lot of high pressure over the New Zealand area right now, which means following the Antarctic blast at the end of June, July is kicking off with some cold air being locked in. There is this warmer side to it, which will come in into the first week of July. So things are going to warm up, but before that happens, this will lock in some cold nights and some frosts around both islands. In fact, frost as far north as Auckland and Northland. So it really is sort of peak winter, I guess, in some parts of New Zealand. As we take a look at the soil moisture anomaly, this is from NIWA. You can see at the moment this little area here between sort of Waitarapa and Hawke's Bay, and we've got another area around northern Otago, South Canterbury. These areas are currently in soil moisture deficit, but actually I like this map a bit more. This comes out of the American government. I know it's really pixelated and New Zealand's quite small, but it does show, I think, a little clearer the fact that Hawke's Bay still needs much more rain, as does South Canterbury. I know we had the floods obviously in Canterbury recently, but that didn't necessarily help everyone across the Canterbury region for those who needed rain. Some got obviously far too much and others didn't get enough. So we're still a bit dry along the whole eastern side of New Zealand and also creeping up a wee bit into northern areas. It's also quite cool to compare New Zealand with Australia. Both these maps, the NIWA one and the American ones here, can be found at ruralweather.co.nz. Just scroll down to the bottom of the page and you'll get the very latest maps there. All right, let's move on into the soil temperatures. And the North Island's fairly mild at the moment. You know, it's quite mild for this time of the year, which means you're still going to get a bit of pasture growth around places like Hawke's Bay in the north, because the soil moisture temperatures are still, the soil temperatures are still in the mid-teens, which is pretty mild. Down here, it does get a lot colder, but still, to be honest with you, I think our soil temperatures at the moment are a little bit higher than they should be for this time of the year. Maybe changing a wee bit now in the South Island. Let's get into the forecast. I know that's what many of you are more interested in, so let's take a look and see what is coming along, and we break it down, as always, week by week, and we show you in these boxes where the low pressure areas are and the high pressure areas are. It's a very good way at just sort of glancing at a sort of a week's setup, because even though this is just one day that we're showing you, it takes a week, you know, for the weather to move along. So for the 1st of July, we kick off with this very powerful high pressure zone moving into New Zealand. The colder southerlies are fading. The Antarctic blast from the end of June, that's gone already, but the colder air is left behind, and so the high comes in and it locks it in, especially at night time. So frosty weather will be kicking off the month of July, the start of the month of July. Frosty conditions, and if you don't have frosts, colder nights anyway. The daytime temperatures aren't too bad, with plenty of sun coming through with this high. Lots of low pressure down here, very normal south of Australia, south of New Zealand at this time of the year. But I guess one pattern we're starting to notice is that the highs are going a little further north. They're tracking along up to the north of us, and that acts like a bit of a lid on those southerly changes. It stops them going too far up the country, and it also stops rainmakers from going too far up the country. So that can be good for some of you, not so good for others. Let's get into the second week of July. So there's that big high. Takes until the second week to move away. Then you get the subtropical northerlies coming down. So it is going to warm up from where the month starts off on this cold note into the second week of July. You'll notice a warmer airflow moving through. There's a lot of low pressure here south of Australia. 3 big lows, the one in the Tasman, another one just south of Perth are the 2 main ones to keep an eye on. They may well end up moving into the New Zealand area, bringing rain, but because of this high pressure belt blocking to the east, that might limit which areas get the rain. Now, as we go into the third week, once again, high pressure still in the New Zealand area, and the next line of highs coming in over Australia, which will track north of New Zealand, which puts a lid on these big stormy systems down here from roaring up northwards across us. When you don't have high pressure, far higher chance of one of these storms bringing up a polar change. But with high pressure coming through, it looks pretty dry and settled. But there's one feature here, which I just want to focus on, that is this northeasterly coming through. We've seen some of the long range maps that go for the next month or two, and they are showing perhaps an uptick in wet weather for New Zealand, which kind of goes against what you're looking at right here. A lot of high pressure around, wondering where that rain is actually going to come in from. But this is only around about the third week of July. We're getting into sort of past the halfway mark, and we're starting to see the Southern Ocean all down here. This is all low pressure. So with a nor'easter coming down, that can open up the window for a wet nor'easter, for rain to come out of the subtropics. And if there's a gap between that high and this one here, and there's all this low pressure down here, you could end up with a system forming in the middle, right about here. So definitely not locked in this far out. But what I'm saying is, when you have an airflow like that out of the subtropics, that can lead to some wet weather for northern facing regions. All right, let's take a look at the first week of rainfall in New Zealand and Australia, the departure from normal. So this is showing what I just said, that most places are leaning drier than average for the first week of the month, and that's because basically of all that high pressure. But look at all the rain out here in the Tasman. That's because of the lows that are stuck out there and the highs that are blocking that wet weather from reaching New Zealand. But my point that I just made was, once those highs actually move away, there is some wet weather out at sea here that could slide in to the New Zealand area. But take a look at Australia. It's looking pretty dry there, except for the eastern side. The eastern side's got plenty of wet weather and colder weather as well, which you'll see when we get into the temperatures, but drier than average over a big chunk. But to be honest with you, Aussie's map here is actually looking pretty good. It's dry in the desert, surprise, surprise. But where the farms are and where people live, pretty much normal weather for Australia, which bodes a little better for New Zealand getting some wet weather in, because it is still a bit drier than average in some regions, as I mentioned, Hawke's Bay and parts of Canterbury and even the upper North Island. It might be getting wetter on the ground, but remember, we're in a 3-year rainfall deficit, so we need more rain. This is the first half of July's rainfall, showing the accumulation maps. As usual, we highlight in the white boxes the areas that aren't likely to get a huge amount. So for the first half of July, these areas are fairly dry. And to be honest with you, it's fairly standard with where we've been for the last wee while. The North Island's leaning drier and the eastern side is also leaning drier. There's a little bit of wet weather perhaps clipping up here around Gisborne and northern Hawke's Bay, but the bulk of the rain is out in the Tasman Sea, and that's where you're looking at totals of 100 to 200 millimetres out at sea. So this is how IBM are looking at New Zealand's rainfall for the month of July. This is a little different. It's showing a bit more rain coming in, and I'm wondering, these blue areas you see here to the north and northeast, and also the top of the South Island, looks to me like a wet northerly coming in, which is what I was talking about in that third week of July, where there's that nor'easter coming through. Now, it's way too early to lock that in with any detail, but it gives us a sort of a rough understanding that there might be a period of time with northerlies coming down that could encourage rainfall to go wetter than average. That's what you see in the blue and the green. The green you see in Hawke's Bay, don't get too excited just yet. That may well just be up in the hills and ranges, not so much further down into the more populated areas. It still looks pretty dry though across many parts of New Zealand, including the west coast, which is perhaps leaning the driest of all. Temperatures now. Okay, the last few updates we've done on this, in fact, the last year's worth, New Zealand looks just like this yellow blob, and I realised that maybe we need to go a little bit bigger picture to kind of explain it a bit better, because you can see Australia's not leaning warmer than average, so it's not a glitch. It's not like New Zealand's always got this yellow shading. But what it shows is the departure from normal, and it's a little bit hard to read the key, but just keep it simple. Here's the middle part, 0 degrees. So anything that's in the yellows and reds leans a little bit warmer than average, and blues and greens and purples lean cooler than average. Very clear to see that a large portion of Australia in July will be leaning cooler than average due to more southerlies coming through for them. But on the New Zealand side, despite the cold change and the colder nights coming up over the next week or the first week of July, generally speaking, July in New Zealand is leaning a little bit warmer than average. It may not be much, it might be closer to normal in some areas, but it is still leaning that slightly warmer side of things. And before we finish, what's going on with La Niñas and El Niños, that sort of stuff? Well, at the moment, we're in a neutral zone, inactive. And also, that's staying that way for July, staying that way for September, and also as we go towards the end of the year into November, it might be leaning a little bit back towards La Nina. What does that mean? It means the sea surface temperatures north of New Zealand will be just a little bit warmer than average, which can encourage a little bit more rain. In saying that, we had warmer than average sea conditions over the last summer and we didn't get the rain. So it needs to be a really strong La Nina for New Zealand to have a really good chance at getting a lot of wet weather. At the moment, it's in that neutral zone, which means anything can happen. And I think we're going to see a fair bit of normal winter weather coming in over the next wee while, but also some settled weather as well. That is all from me. Thanks for all the support we get from YouTube and from all our viewers. We'll be back again in 1 month for our next Climate Watch update.